Welcome to this deep dive.
Mhm.
We're going to be exploring Fooled by Randomness by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. We've got excerpts from the book and even the table of contents, so we can really get into like the nitty-gritty of his arguments, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
And this deep dive is all about how randomness shapes success,
Mm.
how it affects the way we make decisions, and even how we think about history.
And I think Taleb's background is really key here. The book mentions he worked in finance and has a PhD in mathematics.
Oh, wow.
So he's got this really interesting perspective on how randomness affects both like markets and life in general.
Yeah, it's like he's got this secret decoder ring for spotting luck,
Yeah,
where other people just see skill.
exactly.
Okay, so the book opens with this story about King Croesus and Solon, the Greek legislator. And it's in this chapter called Solon's Warning. Why don't we start there?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. It really sets the stage for like the whole book. So Croesus is this incredibly wealthy king. He's got all the riches you can imagine, and he's totally convinced that this makes him happy. So he asks Solon, who's known for his wisdom,
Hmm.
who's the happiest man in the world.
And I bet Croesus was expecting Solon to point right back at it.
Exactly. But Solon totally throws him a curveball.
Mm.
He starts talking about all these men who lived these noble lives and died these heroic deaths.
Oh, wow.
And this just like throws Croesus for a loop. Solon's whole point is that you just can't judge a person's happiness until their life is over because fortune is so fickle. You know? I mean, think about it. Croesus ended up losing his kingdom and everything he had.
Oh, man. Talk about a reality check, right?
Yeah.
Especially in a world that's, so obsessed with instant gratification, overnight success.
Right.
It's a good reminder that things can change in an instant.
Mm.
And we shouldn't assume that just because you have wealth or success, that equals happiness.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
And it brings us to one of the central themes of the book. We often misattribute success to skill and underestimate the impact of randomness. Take like a lottery winner. Do we think they're like a financial genius?
Probably not.
No, but we might assume that someone who made millions in the stock market is.
Right. It's like we see the outcome and we kind of like work backwards to create a story that fits,
Yeah,
even if that story is, more about luck than anything else.
exactly. Now, the book introduces this really interesting character named Nero Tulip.
Okay.
He's a very successful trader, but what's interesting about him is that he has a PhD in literature.
Wait, hold on. A literature PhD turned quant. That's not your typical Wall Street story.
Not at all. It makes you wonder if there is some secret formula for beating the market.
Right.
Well, what's fascinating about Nero is that his success isn't about finding that magical formula. His strategy is really all about minimizing risks.
Okay.
He's content with small, consistent gains and avoids those big losses, almost like he's playing defense instead of offense.
So he's not swinging for the fences. He's more about protecting his capital and letting the gains come over time.
Exactly.
Interesting, Taleb contrasts Nero with another trader named John, a high-yield bond trader.
Yeah.
John made a killing in the 90s, but it seemed like it was very tied to the overall positive trend in the market at the time.
Right. It's a perfect example of how we can be fooled by randomness. John's success might have had more to do with being in the right market at the right time than any special skill. He was essentially riding a wave. Now imagine you're an investor looking at their track records.
Mhm.
Who would you be more likely to invest with? Probably John, right? Even though Nero might be the more skilled and cautious trader in the long run.
Yeah, that's so true.
Yeah.
It really highlights how tricky it can be to separate skill from luck, especially when we only see the end result.
Absolutely.
Which kind of brings us to another key concept in the book, survivorship bias. Can you unpack that a bit?
Sure. So Taleb uses this analogy of a dentist with a steady income versus a lottery winner to illustrate this.
Yeah.
They may both end up wealthy, but we tend to admire the dentist's path more because it seems like something we can achieve through hard work.
But what we don't see are all the dentists who struggled to build their practice or even went bankrupt.
Exactly.
Just like we don't see all the people who bought lottery tickets and never won a dime. It's like we only focus on the success stories.
Right.
And we completely ignore all the failures, which really distorts our view of what it actually takes to succeed.
Yeah, and it makes success seem more attainable than it actually is.
Okay, so we've talked about the dangers of, assuming skill based on outcomes. But how do we actually start to make sense of the role of chance in our own lives? It can feel really overwhelming. Like
Yeah.
anything could happen at any moment. It does, doesn't it? Like we're just kind of rolling the dice with every decision we make.
Yeah.
Taleb introduces this idea of, or this tool, I guess you could say, called a Monte Carlo simulation,
Right.
to help us like grapple with randomness. What exactly is that?
So think of it as like running thousands of what-if scenarios on a computer, like creating all these alternate realities where we can see how things might have turned out differently just based purely on chance.
Mhm.
Instead of looking at history as this single fixed storyline,
Yeah.
you get to see all these branching possibilities.
So instead of assuming things had to happen a certain way, we can see how all these random events could have led to completely different outcomes.
Exactly.
It really challenges that idea that everything is, predetermined, doesn't it?
It throws that whole concept of historical inevitability right out the window.
Yeah.
And this also ties into that concept of nonlinearity that he talks about in the chapter called Loser Takes All on the Nonlinearities of Life.
Okay.
He uses this example of a sand pile. So you can add grains of sand, one by one, and for a while nothing really happens.
All right.
But then one seemingly insignificant grain can trigger this massive avalanche.
That's such a powerful visual. It's a reminder that cause and effect aren't always so straightforward. Sometimes a really small change can have this huge, unpredictable ripple effect.
Absolutely. And that's why those black swan events, those totally unexpected occurrences, can be so impactful. We tend to assume that change happens gradually,
Right.
but in these really complex systems, a tiny event can cascade into these massive, unpredictable shifts.
It makes you realize that we really need to be more prepared for the unexpected.
Yeah.
And I think that this is where that concept of skewness comes in. Not all distributions are nice and symmetrical like a bell curve.
No, they aren't. As Taleb explains in the chapter on skewness and asymmetry, skewness is all about how much that curve is distorted. So in a skewed distribution, rare high-impact events, those black swans become much more likely than our intuition might tell us.
So even if things look stable for a long time, there could be all these hidden risks lurking beneath the surface just waiting to pounce.
Exactly.
Taylor brings up the peso problem as an example.
Yeah.
The Mexican peso seemed incredibly stable against the US dollar for years,
Right.
and then bam, sudden devaluation.
Yeah. It's a great illustration of how past performance isn't always a reliable predictor of the future. We might get lulled into this false sense of security, because things have been calm for a while.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that we're out of the woods.
It's almost like we're trying to make sense of randomness using the wrong tools.
Yeah.
Our brains just aren't wired for probability, are they?
No, not really. In the chapter Randomness in Our Brain, we are probability blind. Taleb really dives into those cognitive biases that make us so bad at assessing risk. Take, for example, the availability heuristic. We tend to overestimate the likelihood of things that are easily recalled, like those really vivid or sensational events.
So we might be more afraid of a shark attack than a car accident,
Right.
even though statistically car accidents are far more common.
Yeah.
It's because those images of shark attacks are just so vivid and memorable.
Exactly. And the media plays a role here, too. The focus on the dramatic and the sensational because it grabs our attention. But it can really distort our perception of risk, making us more afraid of these really unlikely events while we ignore those more mundane but statistically more significant risks.
So if we're essentially wired to be fooled by randomness, what can we actually do about it? Should we just throw up our hands and say, well, whatever happens, happens?
Well, Taleb wouldn't advocate for giving up. He's a trader himself. But he does argue for a more humble approach,
Sure.
one that really acknowledges the limits of our predictive abilities. It's not about abandoning logic or reason, but just being aware of their limitations in a world that's full of randomness.
So less hubris and more humility.
Exactly.
Less focus on trying to predict the future and more on managing risk and just being prepared for the unexpected.
Right.
Which is where his idea of living with randomitis comes in. He talks about this in chapters like Wax in My Ears and Gambler's Ticks and Pigeons in a Box. What are some of the key takeaways there?
So he talks about limiting exposure to those rare high-impact events. Think
Yeah.
about it like not betting your entire life savings on a single spin of the roulette wheel. He also emphasizes minimizing those emotional reactions to the inevitable ups and downs. It's a very stoic approach. Don't get caught up in that daily noise. Focus on the long game.
So it's about cultivating a certain level of detachment, almost like putting those metaphorical wax in my ears
Right.
to tune out the constant chatter and hype. Taleb even compares us to pigeons in a box.
He does. Pigeons can develop all these really superstitious behaviors associating random rewards with specific actions, even though there's no actual connection.
Oh, wow.
And Taleb argues that traders, even those experienced ones, can fall into the same trap, developing rituals and beliefs that have no basis in reality.
Because we crave that feeling of control. of
Yeah.
having an explanation for why things happen.
Right.
And that brings us to one of my favorite concepts from the book, the narrative fallacy.
Ah, yes. We love to create these stories to make sense of the world, even when those stories are more about our need for meaning than actual causality.
Right.
We look back at events and we impose this narrative, even if chance played a huge role.
The media does this all the time, right? Every market move has to have this simple, compelling story.
Exactly.
Stocks fell today on fears of.
Right, as if they know what millions of investors are thinking.
Right. Like it's often just speculation dressed up as analysis.
Exactly. And this kind of simplistic storytelling can be really dangerous. It can lead to bad decisions based on flawed assumptions. Taleb has a whole section on the Bloomberg explanations where he just critiques this tendency to attribute market moves to specific news events.
Oh, interesting.
It's a good reminder that reality is often far more complex than the stories that we tell ourselves about it.
Okay, so we've established that, we love stories. We're wired to be fooled by randomness, and the media often feeds into these tendencies.
Hmm.
So what's the antidote? How do we actually break free from these patterns of thinking?
Well, Taleb doesn't offer any easy solutions, but he does advocate for a very skeptical questioning approach. He even suggests being skeptical of rationality, which seems a bit radical coming from someone with a math background.
It's like he's saying think critically even about critical thinking.
Right.
But I think what he's getting at is that our models and frameworks can only take us so far.
Yeah.
We have to be open to the possibility that we might be wrong, that there might be things we simply can't predict or control.
Exactly. And maybe that's where we can learn from those ancient philosophers like Solon. Don't assume you have it all figured out just because things are going well right now.
Mhm.
Fortune is fickle.
So understanding randomness isn't about predicting the future. It's about making better decisions under uncertainty.
Absolutely.
Being prepared for those unexpected twists of fate, those moments when the best laid plans just go out the window.
Right.
And maybe finding a way to thrive in the midst of all that chaos.
That's the real challenge, isn't it? Finding that balance between planning and adaptability, between caution and openness to new possibilities.
Well, on that note, I think it's time for us to move to the final part of our deep dive into Fooled by Randomness. What stands out to you as like the most crucial message from our exploration so far? What's that one big idea you want our listener to really wrestle with?
You know what stands out to me is this idea that, like, by trying to eliminate randomness completely, by clinging to this illusion of control, we actually become more fragile.
More fragile.
Yeah. And not just in our finances, but in life in general.
It's kind of counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
We think that by planning and predicting, we're making ourselves safer.
Yeah.
But Taleb's saying, like, no, that's actually the opposite.
He flips it on its head. He
Yeah.
compares it to driving a car. If you're so focused on avoiding every little bump in the road,
Yeah.
you're more likely to overcorrect and swerve off and crash. You need to have some tolerance for those little deviations to actually navigate successfully.
It's about finding that sweet spot, right?
Yeah.
Between being cautious but also being flexible.
It's
You know,
right.
planning for the future but also being able to adapt when things inevitably go off script.
Which is most of the time.
Right, exactly.
Mhm.
And that's where I think that stoic philosophy of like accepting what you can't control really comes in handy.
Yep.
It's not about being passive. It's about choosing where you focus your energy.
Right. What can you actually influence?
So,
Your own actions and your reactions. That's where your power lies.
it's like that saying control the controllables.
Exactly.
You play the hand you're dealt, but you got to play it strategically.
Right. And sometimes those unexpected twists of fate lead to the most amazing opportunities.
Yeah.
If everything went according to plan, life would be pretty boring, wouldn't it?
I think you're right.
Yeah.
So embracing randomness isn't about just giving up,
Right.
It's about opening ourselves up to these new possibilities that we might have totally missed if
Yeah.
we were too busy trying to control every little detail.
Exactly. It's about becoming what Taleb calls anti-fragile.
Okay.
Not just surviving those unexpected events, but actually growing stronger because of them.
Okay, so how do we actually do that? How do we cultivate anti-fragility in our own lives? That sounds great in theory, but what are like some concrete steps we can take?
Well, he uses this example of the immune system.
Yeah.
So when you're exposed to a virus, your body learns to fight it off right.
Right.
And it makes you more resilient in the future. It's the same principle with like taking calculated risks.
Right.
Taking on challenges helps us develop new skills, build our confidence.
So instead of always trying to avoid discomfort, we should maybe lean into it a little bit.
A little bit. Obviously not doing anything reckless, but maybe stepping outside that comfort zone more often.
Right. What's a small calculated risk that you could take that might help you grow in a certain area.
Right, exactly.
Maybe it's starting a side hustle, taking a class in something totally new, or even just like speaking up more in meetings.
Yeah, those are great examples.
It really makes you wonder if our obsession with control is actually making us more vulnerable in the long run.
It could be.
By trying to eliminate all risk, we might be missing out on opportunities for growth and resilience.
It's a really fascinating question to ponder. And, that's the beauty of Fooled by Randomness. It's
Yeah.
not about giving you all the answers. It's about challenging you to think differently,
Yeah.
to question those assumptions,
hmm
and to really embrace that uncertainty that's just an inherent part of life.
It's a call to become more comfortable with not knowing.
Absolutely.
Be open to the unexpected and to recognize that sometimes the best thing we can do is just ride the wave.
Well said.
Yeah. Well, on that note of embracing the unknown, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into Fooled by Randomness.
It has been a fascinating exploration.
It has. It really has.
Ah,
Chance uncertainty and the limits of our own understanding.
yeah.
I really hope our listener has found this journey as thought-provoking and insightful as we have. It's definitely given us a lot to think about.
It has. It's one of those books that just stays with you long after you finish reading it.
It really is. So to our listener, as you go about your day, remember to keep questioning those assumptions, stay curious, and be open to the possibility that even the most seemingly certain outcomes might just be the result of blind luck. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep into those fascinating ideas that shape our world.